Good morning. I'm off to work in about an hour, so I thought I'd try to make a fairly short video for the family members, meaning those people whose children, parents sometimes, brothers, sisters, whoever, family members or friends have somebody in rehab and want to know a little bit more about what it involves. Now, I only have experience with the rehab that I work in, but many of them work roughly along the same lines, so I'd urge you, if that is the situation you find yourself in, I would urge you to watch the video through and see what you think. The first point I'd like to make is that it's brave of your family member to go into a rehab in the first place. Some people come into rehab and they're not ready to change. They come to maybe they've got a drink driving court case coming up, or they've got a boss that's threatening them, or a wife or a husband, and they come in and they're not particularly ready to do the work. But in the main, it's a brave thing to do, because someone's accepted that the way I've been living my life up to now hasn't worked, and I'm ready to give my life a complete overhaul, and you know, so that's a brave thing to do. It's also brave for the family members to look at themselves and see how they've been affected by someone else's addiction. And whereas the addict or the alcoholic often has denial, it's not as bad as all that, and minimizing it down, I haven't really hurt anybody, etc. Well, often the family members have some denial as well, which is, well, it's them that's got the problem, not me. But they can get into, some people, not all, but some of the family members do get into a kind of rescuing, enabling behaviour, where they'll come in, they'll rush in to try and help the person, and it's become a real habit, and quite often, you know, can be a type of illness themselves, and they've used various terminology to describe the family effects of addiction, probably the most popular being codependency. So there's actually three groups that are maybe appropriate for family members who have a loved one in rehab or in early recovery, or perhaps on the edge of asking for help and still in active addiction. And they are Al-Anon, which is the sister organisation to Alcoholics Anonymous. So that's, let's use blue, AL-ANON. Co-Anon is kind of the sister organisation to Cocaine Anonymous, I think, but Cocaine Anonymous, as I've said in other videos, is a badly named fellowship in my opinion. It's a fully inclusive fellowship, so if someone's just a drinker, they're welcome in CA. If someone uses other substances like heroin or cannabis, then they're welcome in Cocaine Anonymous as well. They don't have to have used cocaine. So that's basically the alcohol family group and the drug family group. And there's another one that might be interesting, or they use that's my alcoholic perfectionism coming in, CODA, which is Codependence Anonymous, or Codependence Anonymous. In fact, I have a document here which was sent to me by someone, which is a very useful document. It describes patterns of codependence. So in there they'll have denial patterns, having a difficulty identifying what you're feeling, minimize, alter or deny how they feel, perceive themselves as completely unselfish and dedicated to the well-being of others, and so on. There's characteristics here. Denial patterns, low self-esteem patterns, compliance patterns, control patterns, and finally avoidance patterns. So as I've said before, once the website's up and running, I'll put a copy of that on and you can download it and have a read for yourself. So that was really the first point. For anybody family member or recovering person, to admit there's a problem is very brave. It's difficult. Change is difficult for human beings. We like things to stay the way they are, and to accept that a rigorous overhaul of one's life is a necessity is difficult. There's an old AA joke. You only need to change one thing, everything, and there is some real truth to that. When family members ring up me when I'm working at the rehab, depending on what they say, there's a number of things I end up repeating time and time again, and part of my hope for this video is that when I don't have time to talk to a family member, I can refer them to this video and they can consider some of the stuff in here. One of the first things I say to some people is, first of all, do you understand the difference between detox and treatment? So quite often the family member will be only asking about detox. How's the detox going? Are the meds enough for them? What's going on with the detox? And you can hear that in the family member's mind, they understand what detox is, and they're putting a real big emphasis on detox. And I'll have to say to them, right, okay, yeah, the detox is going well, but do you understand the difference between detox and treatment? And some people do, and sometimes there's a long gap on the phone. And I'll explain that detox is simply the process of removing the substance without too much uncomfortableness. I mean, every detox by its nature is uncomfortable. It's not going to be a brilliant experience where you're going to float away from your addiction and land in a sea of bliss. That's not what detox is like. It's an uncomfortable process by its nature. But the main point about the medications that we give to people is it stops the withdrawal symptoms being so bad that they either become injured or have a seizure, or are so uncomfortable that they run away from the centre and go and drink or use to cope. So it's not a comfortable process, but they shouldn't come to any harm whilst undergoing it. So for people who come with alcohol problems, the drug we use is chlorodiazepoxide, which is everybody calls Librium. I think that was the original brand name. And it's a benzodiazepine, and basically in the same class as Valium, and basically it calms people down. It stops seizures, because of the people that have seizures, unfortunately, about 10% of people who have seizures, roughly, can have seizures which could be life-threatening. So, and no one ever died of an opiate withdrawal. I've heard stories of many people going cold turkey on the floor of a jail in the years before they really cared in prisons about opiate addicts and their withdrawal symptoms, and you can't die. It's very uncomfortable, but you can't die. So for them we tend to use, if they're on methadone and they prefer to do that, we can bring them down to maybe 30 mils a day, and then sometimes all the way through, or sometimes swap them across to Subutex. So buprenorphine is the actual drug. Again, everybody calls it Subutex. And the main thing about that, it's a kind of blocker. So what you want to do is wait between 24 and 48 hours before having the first dose. I've seen people who've lied to the doctor about when they last used heroin, writhing around on the floor, grabbing their legs in fetal position, because they've not been honest and they've not left it long enough before putting the Subutex in, which brings them into a precipitative withdrawal, because it will block the heroin that's in the system as well as doing what it does. So this is given in doses which in our rehab we don't do maintenance anything, it's always reducing. The goal of a detox is to take the person from whatever level that they're on down slowly over a week or two down to zero, and so that they have left the substance behind. For example, we use the Detox Protocols by the National Institute of Clinical Excellence in the UK, NICE. So for alcohol, for example, we have 4. We have the mild regime, mild, moderate, severe and very severe. So there's 4 categories. And the doctor will decide which one's appropriate, and sometimes we have to phone the doctor and have it changed because everybody responds to medication slightly differently. So sometimes they can be falling asleep in the group and they're not learning, and we'll think maybe they've exaggerated how much they were drinking and they're over medicated, or maybe just Librium has had a bigger effect on them than it has had on other people. Other people, they're still shaking, and we're phoning the doctor to say, look, we need to increase this because it's not holding them. So we do titrate the initial detox protocol at times. Usually our doctor is very good at it. Usually he gets it right. So that's what detox is about. When people come into our rehab, the full treatment program is 12 weeks. So clearly what we do is much more than just detox. And the difference is that treatment is what stops them putting the substance in once they finish their detox. Now, what is the point of spending whatever it costs to come into a rehab residential setting and spending a significant amount of money on having a detox if that person then leaves the centre and uses on day 1 outside? Well, that's just a waste of money, isn't it? So what I'm more interested in is the treatment side of things, and the treatment is what stops them putting it back in. So detox is like the tip of the iceberg, but the treatment from the illness is actually what we're mainly dealing with. So the first part of treatment is we teach the guys what the problem is, and that is from there everything follows. And quite often for the family members I'll say, so who was it I spoke to the other day? Yes, it was a family member of a young heroin addict, and I said to her, do you realise that your husband's problem isn't drugs? And you always get the long silence. And I learned this years ago. There was an AA speaker who said if an alcoholic's problem was alcohol and you took alcohol away from them, then you'd be taking the problem away and they'd be fine. But it's actually the other way around. An alcoholic's problem isn't alcohol. A drug addict's problem isn't the drugs. Because when you take them away, they get worse, not better. They start climbing the walls with frustration, anxiety and despair. When you say that to family members on the phone, they get it, they know. They've experienced at times, usually, a period where they've not had anything and they can see the behaviours are getting worse. They're more and more uncomfortable. And the reason for that is that the substance is really what they've been using to self-medicate the real problem. The real problem is this underlying spiritual or emotional illness. So the drugs are just their distraction, just their self-medication for that. So when we give them a detox, this is why I take the detox is just the tip of the iceberg. When you get them through a detox, all you're doing is taking the substance away. Unless you follow that up with a treatment process, the likelihood is they will get progressively more uncomfortable until they'll have no choice but to pick up a drink or a drug, and then they're back to square one. So step 1, the beginning of understanding the problem, is to teach them how this illness works. Now, we don't diagnose anybody. We do for detox and dependency, but what you're going to learn, hopefully, is that the threefold illness of addiction as viewed from a 12-step perspective is a different thing to dependency, physical dependency. Those two things are very different. In fact, hopefully at the weekend I'll do a video on the threefold illness, which is that, versus physical dependency, and you'll very clearly see the differences. I would urge you to watch that video once it's up. So what is the illness that we have, that I have, that most, I would say 99.95 percent of people come to our rehab with, and that is this illness. So the expression of step one, which is just a one-sentence summary of step one, is that we admitted we were powerless over whatever the substance was, whatever the distraction was. So it could be opiates, or it could be benzodiazepines, or it could be alcohol, or it could be gambling, or it could be food, or it could be, there's about 1,000 distractions. There's no point in me listing them all. But this is the expression of what the distraction is. And if you view the step one video, you'll see this in detail. But for you guys as family members, we're just going to go through it quite quickly. So your family member is going to have to admit, and that means to fully concede to ourselves. It's not just to say, yeah, my name's Bob and I'm an alcoholic. It's to fully concede to our innermost self. So it's admission at depth, which is more like an inner recognition, where someone sees it and they viscerally, internally recognize, shit, this is me. So it's not just intellectually acknowledging, it's more of a heartfelt inner insight where they get it. And our friend described it as something broke inside her when she saw it. I'll give you another example. I've often wondered, why does one person get it and another person doesn't? What can we do to make sure everybody gets it? And there are things about how addiction works, in particular how surrender work, which I don't think anybody understands. It's very, very difficult. So I was in a meeting, and I can't remember the fellowship, but it was somewhere around the St Albans area one time. And there was a guy there who was talking about his surrender, and he said, at the time of that this happened, and he'd been in recovery and regularly attending meetings and doing quite well at this point. But he was sort of reflecting back, and at that time he was homeless, but he felt superior to all the other homeless people because he had a tent. And it was raining one night, and so where he felt sorry for the other homeless people who were sleeping in doorways and doing the best they could to get out the rain, he took his tent into the grounds of St Albans Abbey, which is a really nice church, which is kind of uplit in the evenings, and it's really quite beautiful there. So he skipped over the wall or the fence and set up his tent with the door view of the tent looking at this incredible abbey, uplit at night. And he was really pleased with himself. Those other poor buggers are out in this rain and doorways, and here I am in my cosy little tent, and I've got my 2 litres of cider, and I've got a bit of heroin, and I've got a bit of hash and tobacco and papers for rolling, and and he was just using those things and feeling great. So what happened was, the next night he went back to recreate that scene, and so when everyone had disappeared and it was quiet, and he hopped over the same part of the wall or the fence, went to this exact same place where the tent had been pitched the night before, and he pitched it again with the same view. So what we do, isn't it, we try to recreate meals out and certain scenes in our life, and it usually doesn't go as well the second time. But he recreated the scene, and he had the same 2 litres of cider, a bit of heroin, a bit of hash, whatever it was. And he said he looked at the church and he just burst into tears and said, I can't go on like this. So what was it that was different from the first night to the second night? Well, nobody knows. But one thing we're pretty sure about, it's not external circumstances that cause an internal break, an internal recognition. Nobody quite can put the finger on what makes that happen. One thing we as professionals are pretty clear on is that we can't give that to somebody. We can surround them with recovery information. We can get them to write consequences paper. The family members can write consequences letters to remind them of certain incidents they've forgotten or that their denial won't let them see. And these things can be helpful. But in terms of scientifically creating this breaking point, nobody knows how to do that. So that's what we do in rehab. We try to give them some written work and some assignments whereby somewhere along the road they're going to get it. But we can't guarantee that that's going to happen because it has to come from within. And if someone's actively resisting that, there's nothing we can do. There's really nothing we can do. One of the most important questions for the recovering person is, do you want to stop? And I find myself asking this to a lot of people, and some people say, well, I'm here, aren't I? And it's not good enough. They could be motivated by an up-and-coming court case, by the wife or the husband on the back, by a drink driving thing, or any of these things, external pressures where they're thinking, well, if I go to rehab I'll get out of it, or I'll make it look good, and they're not at the stage of stopping. So as a family member, if my daughter, for example, ended up with a serious drug problem, that would be the question I'd be looking to ask. Do you actually want to stop? Not are you just pleasing me, or the other things are in array and you want the pain to stop. Are you actually at a stage of wanting to stop drinking or taking drugs for good and for all, as the old timers used to say? Are you actually done? This is the first question. And if family members ask me, I would suggest they don't invest in someone's rehab until they're pretty sure that that person means business. Otherwise, chances are it might take them a few stages forward, but if money's short and treatment's expensive and they've only got one shot at it, it's probably better to wait until they've actually had this inner collapse where they are now ready to do business. And that's hard. It's hard when you don't know about addiction recovery. It's hard when you don't understand the process, when you don't understand treatment, to know when's the right time to invest money in this thing. It's very difficult, and my parents went through all of that. They had to watch me destroying my life for years and years, unwilling to accept help. And the way it worked with me is I smashed my life to pieces and then went and said, okay, Dad, I'm ready now. And thank God he said, okay, right, off you go to rehab. And I only ever went to rehab once. There are people in the centre where I'm working now who've been to rehab 10 plus times. I don't understand what that's about, other than possibly maybe they've become institutionalised and it's easier to just go off to a rehab when things are bad. Maybe it's just easier than surviving out in the world. Having a little rest, putting themselves back together and then going out and using again. Maybe that becomes a habit or a pattern. With me it wasn't that way. I felt so guilty that Mum and Dad would have to pay for me again because I got them to bail me out. That was their enabling. They didn't know any of this. And this is not a blame thing, but they bailed me out when I had drug debts or student debts, or mainly to do with drinking and taking drugs, they would come in and help as they saw it. But anything that prevents the addict or alcoholic from hitting bottom, and it might be they need to spend 2 or 3 nights on the streets before the penny drops and they have this internal break. This is why I feel for the family so much, because if it was my daughter, I wouldn't want to think of her having to sleep rough. My instinct would be to come in and prevent that. I wouldn't give her money, and I wouldn't pay her debts off, and I wouldn't do washing and buy food, and then she could divert the money that would have gone on food to drugs. I wouldn't enable in that way. But whether you could get to the point of saying, of detaching with love, which is really what Al-Anon teaches. I've been to a load of Al-Anon meetings. They sometimes want someone in recovery to come and talk to their group, so I've done that quite a lot. And they talk about detaching with love, where instead of rejecting a person, which could be counterproductive, and they could go and kill themselves, what you say is, look, I love you too much to watch you destroying yourself like this, and I can't enable you any further in your addiction. I've realised that the help I've been giving you actually maybe prevented you from hitting a rock bottom, and I can't be a party to that anymore. So we are going to be on the sidelines waiting and hoping that you are going to get serious about getting help, and the minute you want help, we'll be there for you. But at the time, if you want to use, you just go and do that. But because it's your life. We desperately want you to get to recovery, but we understand how this thing works, that it doesn't matter what we want, it only matters what you want and when you're ready. And that's a very difficult message for the families to understand. But it's the best way to bring the person on the edge of recovery to actually, when they realise the game's over and they can't manipulate the family for money anymore, that's one of the main incentives for them to actually have this internal snap and actually go and ask for help. So, this stuff is difficult, hence the video. So, when they come to us, we'll explain what the problem is. So the problem from a 12-step perspective, as we see it, is they've got to fully concede to their innermost selves that they're powerless, and that their spiritual or emotional condition is unmanageable by them, hence all the distractions. So on the powerlessness front, it's really simple. We have almost like an allergic reaction to the stuff. When we drink or take drugs for years, you can't start using them without developing an overwhelming craving to continue. And in the early years, it's not that prevalent or recognizable, but as the years go on, you, particularly once you've come out of a daily use phase, some people do, some people don't, but for me it was most evident at the end when I was promising, because my whole life was on the line. My partner was saying, I'm going to move out and take your daughter away, and I mean it this time, and I had all these incentives, none of which were sufficient, but I had all these incentives, and I really tried to stop. And I found that I couldn't. Now, when I'd had a week or two-week period off, and then I had the first drink or drug, I could really sense this craving at that point. So what our book says is that eventually, over the years, the allergic reaction which produces this craving becomes beyond mental control. So I can have one drink and think I really ought to just have the one or two. I can't do it. Once it's got into my body, all bets are off. And that basically, first piece, means that I can't control the amount. And what I tell the guys in the rehab is, look, if you can't control the amount, wouldn't it be a good idea to never put it in? That is the actual only remedy that's possible for an allergic reaction, is to never have it in the body in the first place. So just on that 1/3 of our illness, the solution is abstinence. Okay, sorry about that. That camera gives out at 29 minutes and 59 seconds for some reason. I didn't think I would go over half an hour, but I did. I do have a tendency to go on a bit. But you've got a choice of turning the video off if you don't want to listen to me going on a bit, but some people will, so I'm not too bothered. So I was talking about my partner having to leave, and that my dad really upset me by saying it was the best thing she'd ever done for me. But I have to admit that had she not done that, I would have maintained the fiction that as long as I had a house in the country and I had a job and I had a partner and a child, that, well, life's okay, isn't it? So for me, it wasn't until I'd accepted that my life wasn't working, and my surrender point was actually that I had all things pretty much removed from my life. So I'd had all these last chances, and she left and took my daughter, and around that time I used to go off to work on a very fast motorbike. I had one of these insanely fast bikes, and I used to go from one end of Hertfordshire into the city of London, which is probably an hour and a half's drive, or possibly 2 hours in a car depending on traffic. I used to do it in an hour on a bike. It was insanity what I used to do. And one day I got knocked off the bike was written off, and I nearly lost my life, really. And that meant that basically I lost my job, because there was no way, I was claustrophobic, there was no way I could sit under someone's armpit on the way, all the way from the tube all the way into London. I just couldn't have coped with that. I was okay on a bike, but I couldn't cope with being on a train up to work. And my car got stolen as well. I'd never had a car stolen, and they just stole it for the tyres and the wheels. But anyway, they stole my car, and so I'd basically lost my partner and daughter, my job, my transport, my means of money, and I was stuck in this country cottage in the middle of nowhere without public transport. And it felt like the universe was saying, come on, come to help, come to rehab, it's done, you're finished. And it was only when I'd lost everything that I said, okay, I'm ready. So what the family members inadvertently do sometimes, not all families work the same way obviously, but what some family members do in an effort to help and support, as a way of encouraging them into recovery, their actions are actually counterproductive, because what it does is it enables them to not hit rock bottom. It kind of gives them a cradle or a support and a safety net, which prevents them hitting rock bottom and asking for help and changing their lives. So this is the problem with enabling. The people that do it often think they're being helpful, but in fact it's counterproductive. And that's what my parents did for me, and they didn't know that they were doing it. It's such an easy mistake to make. That's what these organisations will help people to do. They'll help people to understand which of the helpful behaviours are actually helpful and which might be counterproductive, and they will explain and help teach the concept of detaching with love. And that's why I would recommend, if any of the issues in this video affect you, that you check out these organisations. And during this lockdown, it's actually even easier, because you can go online and sit in a Skype or a Zoom meeting and see what everybody's up to in these meetings without even leaving the comfort of your own home. So if you live in the country and the nearest, say, Al-Anon meeting, if your family member's a drinker, is an hour and a half away or an hour away, you can just sit at home and engage in that meeting. And the feeling of connection and understanding that you'll get from family members that have been through or have overcome the problem that you have right now with your family member, it's magical. To speak to someone who said, oh yeah, my son or daughter where yours is 5 years ago, and these were the things that helped me. These were what we did which seemed to work. This is an invaluable resource for you. Now at the end of the day, you're powerless, that word again, over what they do. All you can really do is what you can influence, which is you and your reactions and the level of support that you offer them, and doing your own work. This is something that they couldn't prevent even if they tried to, whereas the reverse is true as well. You can't make them do anything. I mean, you've probably tried and it hasn't worked. So, that's your evidence that it's a time for a change in approach. One of the things in recovery we use a lot is the effectiveness question. Does it work? And if what you're doing doesn't work, maybe it is time for a change. So I went off on a slight tangent there. So the powerlessness of the body is that we can't control it when we're doing it. And once someone realizes that, they usually try to assert their willpower to stay stopped. And usually it doesn't last for long because of the mental powerlessness. So we term it a mental obsession. I don't particularly like that terminology because sometimes it would just come out of the blue and I wasn't thinking about it a lot before I went back to drinking. But it's a type of subtle insanity where the mind isn't being rational about what the consequences could be of this one drink or drug, and it just leads into a full-blown relapse, and you just think, well, how did that happen? So what we need to see is that if our mind gives us permission to put the first one in, so if you go into an off license and pay money for booze, or probably people order it online now, or phone a dealer, or procure some form of distraction or not, that's a physical action, but it's born in thought. It's your mind that's told you that's a good idea to do this, or we'll get away with it this time, or one won't hurt, or okay, it wasn't that bad, I'll stop tomorrow, I'll just have one last blowout and things will be different tomorrow. These are the type of justifications that addicts and alcoholics have in their minds all the time, and nothing's ever any different. So another way to say that is that we're unable to learn from our mistakes. We'll repeat the same behaviour expecting a different result, in other words. But it's more than that. It's that we don't consider what the terrific consequences could be, and that the suffering and humiliation of even a week or a month ago is not there with sufficient force to prevent us repeating that same mistake over and over again. So that there is the diagnostic criteria for being an alcoholic or being an addict, the powerlessness. The third part is really what the illness is all about. However, it might just be that that's the human condition. So the second half, from this dash onwards, the second half of step one it's like a double-barreled sentence. We've also got to admit that allows it to become unmanageable. A lot of people conclude that because it becomes unmanageable is because of the alcohol, the drugs, the food, the sex, the whatever the distractions are. My experience is it's the other way around. My emotional life was unmanageable by me, therefore I needed all of the distractions to help me cope. So I grew up in Scotland, and for as far back as I can remember, from about the age of 5, I was an uncomfortable child. And unbeknownst to me, when I did all the sport that I did, and collections were a big thing that I did. I had collections of stamps and keys and coins and key rings, and I had all these different collections, and I used to obsess about them. And I'm sure that while I was obsessing about these other things, these distractions, that I wasn't having to feel the pain inside, as long as I could project myself out of my body and into these distractions, that I could cope. And so for me, I was uncomfortable emotionally from a very young age, and when alcohol was probably the first that came along, I just thought, oh, this is it, this works better than those other ones that take a lot of effort. Sport, for example, it's hard work. I used to play football and rugby, and rugby was always at a club and football was always at school, and it wouldn't be uncommon that on one on a Saturday I'd be playing one sport, and on a Sunday I'd be playing the match for the other team. And I did athletics. I was in the Edinburgh Athletic Club. Used to go up to the Meadowbank Stadium and run around the tartan track there. It was a real novelty in the early 80s to run on a proper running track. And it was cross country all winter, and we went everywhere on our bikes, and tennis all summer. And in addition to all that, I swam 7 times a week. So it wasn't just a bit of sport. Now, I didn't know I was doing it to fix my emotional state in an attempt to mediate how bad I felt inside. But my life from 5 until when I discovered alcohol was just full of distractions of that type. And for me, food was a big one. I found myself, when I was uncomfortable, just eating. And the eating one can be either overeating, eating for comfort, or it can be undereating. Some people get a buzz out of the empty feeling. My now ex-wife was that way. So if we fell out, I would start eating more and putting weight on as I was worried about the marriage, and she would stop eating and lose weight and could look quite gaunt until we made up again. And then my weight would start coming down and her weight would start coming up. So the food one can be either direction. If your family member has a food issue, there is a 12-step group for that. It's called Overeaters Anonymous, but they deal with anorexia and bulimia as well. If you're interested in all these distractions, at some point, hopefully at the weekend, I'm going to do a video on cross addiction. Cross addiction is a term that just means that we cross from one thing to another. Usually when we don't get the effect we're looking for, we'll combine and substitute different things to try and get the same effect. You may wish to look at your family member's life because you probably have a lot of information, you don't realise the significance of it. Then please watch that video. So these are the diagnoses. This is actually a blue dotted line. I don't know if you can really see from this camera. But this is the diagnostic criteria for being an addict. The second half, we've got to admit this emotional unmanageability. So we talk about an emotional illness. Perhaps a good description would be a feeling of something's missing. But that can move from a feeling of something's missing right down into a really uncomfortable set of feelings like restless, irritable. I mean, irritable is a good word. It could mean unusually sensitive. Most addicts and alcoholics that I've ever met, and including myself, are very sensitive people. The impact of life upon us is painful. So we're very sensitive, very unhappy. I would add bored, lonely and anxious. Some people's spiritual or emotional illness seems to manifest through boredom. So they'll say, yeah, I'm so bored, if I could just have a drink, then I'll be alright. Or with other people it'd be anxiety. Well, if I'm so anxious, if I could just have a drink, I'll be alright. Or loneliness, or any combination of them really. But the point is that is what inspires the mind to say, well, okay, then just have one won't hurt, it wasn't that bad, we'll stop tomorrow, this time it'll be different. So the way that we live this is this way, the way we learn it in recovery is this way. We have to first learn about the simplest bit of it, which is that we can't control it when we're doing. This is at the beginning of our book that we use, Alcoholics Anonymous textbook, and the doc's opinion. About page 23 it starts to talk about the mind, and we learn about how the mind tricks us into putting the first one in. Now this is very difficult for the family members to understand, because not only if they want 2 drinks can they have 2 drinks, and they think, oh, I've had enough now, I think I'll have a cup of coffee instead or something. We just get thirstier with every one that goes in. So you could be lying on the floor of a pub having 15 pints of very strong lager thinking, oh my God, I'm desperate for a drink. But it's because the alcohol is what's producing the craving, and that's very difficult to understand if you've never had that experience. So the family members tend to assume they must be like me, which means they're being greedy and selfish, and they'll be angry sometimes with the family member for what they're doing, or they'll learn online and they think it's about dependency, and dependency is different from this. Dependency is very simply the body's cells and organs and process adapts to a large amount of drugs or alcohol coming in, and then it sets its system up to cope with that, so not too much damage is being done in the body. And then if you abruptly withdraw that substance, whatever they've become accustomed to, then they'll go into withdrawal symptoms. It's like a spasm of the body saying, hang on a minute, I've set myself up to, where is it? And like I said before, the seizures can be very serious with alcohol. They can die of them. So getting a proper detox, this is why your family member might come to you and say, I've been advised to carry on drinking. You might doubt that and think, why would anybody say that? Well, if you go to a local drug and alcohol team, they might well say, don't stop abruptly because you could have a seizure. That is actually good advice. And that's where the detox comes in, because it's a much safer way for an alcoholic to be moved down off a high level, avoiding a seizure. The one thing that the alcoholic or addict can't do themselves, usually, they can't taper themselves off because of the allergic reaction, which drives them to drink more and more. So a normal person, if they accidentally ended up with a physical dependency, they would think, right, well, I'll go from 20 to 18 to 16 to 14 to 12 to 10. I'll take 2 weeks to tailor myself off, and they would actually be able to avoid any horrific withdrawal symptoms by doing that. But we, alcoholics and addicts of a 12-step variety, can't do that because of the craving. As soon as we have one, we're off again. So we can't tailor down slowly. So when I was in early recovery, one of the problems is I couldn't sleep. And this is something that the guys who come in the centre from forever saying, look, we're just wired to want chemicals, a pill for every ill, and so if you can't sleep, for example, in early recovery, this is quite normal, because when you pass out through using drugs or alcohol, you're actually not sleeping naturally. You're passing out. So the body has to relearn natural sleep. Most of the guys I deal with in the rehab, they'll immediately say, well, I need a sleeping pill. And what I'm saying to them is, yeah, you'll probably get a week's worth, but it's a short-term sleeping aid. We use Zopiclone, but it could be any other one. Short-term sleeping aid, we don't want you to become dependent upon a drug because you're in the rehab to get off drugs. And they're, oh, yeah. And all you're actually doing is you're putting off into the future by how many sleeping pills or chemicals you take. You're just putting off into the future the time when you're going to have to relearn natural sleep. Your body will relearn that, but it'll take a while. And the temptation is to sleep during the day, and then that won't help you get a sleep pattern. So establishing healthy sleep pattern is one of the things that we try to work with people, and they'll say, oh, can I go off and have a sleep? I haven't slept last night. We'll say, look, really try not to, because all you're doing is making it harder for you to sleep tonight, and we really want you to have a healthy sleep pattern back. It's going to make all the difference. So, again, this is a good example of where addiction, recovery and treatment is difficult. There is no way around that. So we'll do sleep hygiene workshops and teach them the principles, and then they'll be more willing to give it a go and to try not to sleep during the day. I had the same problem, and what I did was I would listen to Buddhist talks. I needed an audio book that was not too engaging, exciting, or it would excite me and I wouldn't be able to sleep. But if it was too boring, it couldn't hold my attention. I would lie in bed with the headphones on, but I'd be thinking about my problems. So it was a middle band I was looking for, of something that was interesting enough to hold my attention but not overly exciting. Like if I listened to a fellowship share, I'd be like, yeah, I couldn't sleep. It would be too invigorating for sleep. So what I did in my early recovery was listen to a lot of Buddhist talks. Those guys are very calm, they've meditated for years, they're talking about the mind and the grass is always greener, all these quirks of what it is to be a human being, and they've spent thousands of years observing themselves in meditation and can have a lot to offer about how the mind works. In fact, I was just listening to a brilliant talk by Ajahn Brahms on anxiety and depression. basically mental health talk. It was really good. If I can figure out how to put a link in the top corner, I'll do that. Might be an interesting watch. But the Buddhist that I would listen to more was the abbot of the monastery just up the road from where I was, Amaravati, and that was Ajahn Sumedho. Ajahn just means teacher, but this guy, brilliant guy. And his main teaching that he would teach is the Four Noble Truths, which was the first real sermon of the Buddha, when he became enlightened and said, look, there is suffering, there's an end to suffering, and this is how we do it, kind of thing. And he used to have Sunday talks where he would simplify Buddhism for the layperson. So it was an open day at the place, Amaravati, the monastery, and lay people would come up and sit and listen to the guy. He would be given a topic and he would talk for an hour. And they call them Dharma talks. Dharma means truth in Pali. So he would often focus on simplifying the Four Noble Truths. And the first Noble Truth is that life is dukkha, which is a Pali word for suffering. That inherent in all human beings there is suffering. So now the recovery, I'm listening to Ajahn Sumedho talking about, for all human beings, life has a feeling of something's missing, an emptiness, a restless irritability of the soul. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, is Ajahn Sumedho an alcoholic or an addict? And I realised the reason that some people in recovery talk about a twofold illness is because they're talking about the diagnostic criteria, the physical and mental differences between normal people and alcoholics and addicts. And on a twofold level, that is definitely the diagnostic bit. On a human level, we all have this. I think all human beings have a degree of this spiritual or emotional problem, and it's certainly what the Buddhists talk about restless, irritable discontent. The difference is that we need the 12 steps to treat the spirit, because if we don't become comfortable, we're not going to last in recovery very long. If for 20 years every time you've gotten comfortable you've got a habit to reach for a drink or a drug, and you become comfortable in recovery, how long realistically are you going to be able to stay away from the drugs or the alcohol? So the way the 12 steps works is we don't treat the body, we don't even treat the mind, we treat the spirit of a person. And if they can become a comfortable human being, they're no longer unmanageable, some amazing things happen. We get restored to sanity. So this mad thinking that we have goes away. And you end up in a position, and this is somewhat controversial in AA, but I kind of like throwing the cat amongst the pigeons sometimes. I'll say in an AA meeting, I'm no longer powerless over alcohol. You see eyebrows raised. And I'll tell them how I learned it, and it was about a year in recovery. I was DJing in a pub for someone's birthday. It was very hot, and I'd been working hard and arranging all the lights and the decks and so on, and I was bent over mixing some records together, and someone asked me if I wanted a drink, and I said, yeah, I'll have a pint of orange juice, but it was very loud in there. And then the next thing I know, still very much concentrating on what I was doing, someone came to the side around the back of the deck, so you always tend to be aware of that, and a drink came out, and it was they got me lager, and I said, no, I meant orange juice. And I realised in that moment I'm no longer powerless over alcohol, because I lived for years powerless over alcohol, and there was one thing I couldn't do, was give away or give back free booze. So I believe I still have the craving. If I'd had a drunk, it would have been a disaster, but I was restored to sanity in this part, which meant I was able to say, no thank you, please can you get me orange juice? They just said, fine, I'll give it to someone else and I'll get you an orange juice. It wasn't a problem. But that's the moment, a year into recovery, when I realised that the 12 steps have worked. I'm no longer powerless over alcohol. Maybe it's not my power, but certainly I have the ability to say no where I didn't before. And that's part of the good news that recovery has to bring. You can get to that stage. So the 12 steps are to treat the spirit of a person and make them a comfortable human being so they don't need to use drink and drugs. And these fellowship folks have their own 12-step ways of doing things, but essentially it should bring each person that goes through it to inner transformation where they're a comfortable human being and the problems that they had are no longer there. This is what recovery is all about. So I hope you found that helpful. Thank you for watching the video, and if you do have any questions, you're welcome to email me. I'll put the email in the description below, and I'll try and answer you as best I can, or perhaps I'll collect a few of these and do another video on Q&A of questions that are being asked. But thank you for your time today.